You're listening to Astonishing Healthcare, the podcast hosted by Judy Health, focusing on the biggest issues affecting healthcare consumers, benefits plan sponsors, and health plans. We're covering how things truly work or don't in the U.S. healthcare system and pharmaceutical supply chain, and we're doing it in an astonishingly efficient way.
Hello, and thank you for listening to another episode of the Astonishing Healthcare Podcast. This is Justin Veneri, your host and Senior Director of Communications and Content here at Judy Health. And today's topic is one of my favorites, drug pricing and the ever-increasing pressure or desire to rein in drug prices out there. For as much coverage as drug prices get in the press, it's still a complicated and confusing issue for most people. So we'll have some fun with this discussion and cover the basics and some of the nuances, as well as some of the history. Josh Golden is my guest. Josh is Senior VP of Strategy here, and we're coming off of our 2026 Partner Summit, where there was quite a bit of time spent on topics related to drug prices. And the Trump administration just announced some new tariffs last night. So the timing is good here to have you back on. Josh, thanks for coming on the show again.
That's my pleasure. Great to see you, Justin.
So you were last on, that was a fun discussion with Nick Bolitho, talking about solving pharmacy benefits, the RFP process, improving that. And then going way, way back, you were on solo with me. It was questions to ask your PBM. Believe it or not, that was about 100 episodes ago. It was number 8. I'll link those and some other reference materials for what we're going to talk about in the show notes. But Josh, PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers, they have a lot of control. There's a lot of choices. One of the key things they do to provide benefits, solutions to payers, employers, municipalities, et cetera, is contract with all parties. Within those contracts, there's terms that dictate everything from what price benchmark might be used to how much of the pharmaceutical manufacturer revenue might pass through, maybe some performance guarantees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've seen a ton of these contracts because of your experience. Take a minute, tell us a bit about your background for any new listeners out there, your path to CapRx, now Judy Health, and what do you do here?
Yeah, I've seen a few contracts. I think you could say that. At some point, I started dreaming about them. I would see contracts chasing me in my nightmares. So a little bit of history about myself. I joined Capital RX about 6 years ago. But prior to that, I spent over 2 decades as a pharmacy benefits consultant, working for a number of different firms, big and small, but really focused narrow and deep in the area of PBM relationships with clients. So helping large employers, labor unions, municipalities, government entities, et cetera, navigate the murky waters of PBM land. And in particular, managing those contracts, negotiating them, auditing them, et cetera. So yeah, I've seen hundreds of them. I've seen big and small. I think the biggest one I saw was north of 200 pages long. So probably strained my lower back trying to lift some of those back when we were exchanging them in hard copy format. And yes, I am old enough to have seen hard copy contracts. So yeah, I've seen the industry from a number of different angles, but I would say throughout that entire journey have been pretty universally frustrated with some of the standards of practice that exist out there around how these contracts are structured.
All right, so let's get into it. Drug prices. And I know we could go down a bunch of different rabbit holes here, and I'll try to stay on track with the questions. AWP is the predominant benchmark or reference point. How come this is still the predominant index utilized in these contracts?
Yeah, well, you're right, Justin. If you're talking about the PBM plan sponsor relationship, no discussion around drug pricing is complete without talking about AWP and frankly acknowledging some of the shortcomings and issues with it. Average wholesale price, we have to remember, starts off pretty arbitrarily. It is set by manufacturers. It's published at a national level. The attractiveness of it is that it does create at least a nationally agreed upon starting point for price that downstream supply chain folks can kind of discount off of, right? So it's an anchor price like an MSRP. But I think we've all realized over time that it is not tethered to the real world price of drugs at all. And in fact, in many cases, we can track literally month to month AWP increasing for a drug while the real world price of that drug goes down. So it is not tied to reality. It's set essentially arbitrarily. And in fact, it's subject to manipulation. That's the other thing that folks often forget. And there's a pretty sordid history that you have to know about AWP that goes back to the late 90s, early 2000s, where supply chain entities, including First Data Bank, the major publisher of AWP at the time, McKesson, a wholesaler, and some others, were actually accused of starting to manipulate AWP. Now, this really shouldn't have been a surprise for folks because the profitability of these folks, the wholesalers, the PBMs, et cetera, were all tied to AWP. As AWP was going up, so was the profitability of every supply chain intermediary whose margin was tied to AWP. So this type of manipulation of this index is almost inevitable in an industry that is profit-seeking. It all culminated throughout the early 2000s in a series of class action lawsuits that were brought against entities like First Data Bank. The most significant of these went to court and they started the trial process. It ended up settling out of court for $350 million,
Oh,
which
wow.
gives you sort of a hint or a sense of the size and scale of the manipulation that was going on here with just one intermediary. This was between First Data Bank and McKesson at the time. I want to remind folks, it was plan sponsors that brought these class action suits against the supply chain intermediaries. Plan sponsors were the canary in the coal mine. They were the detectives solving this crime, essentially, because they were the ones bearing the cost of it, right? As AWP was increasing and all of these plan sponsor PBM contracts were tethered to AWP, then they were seeing their costs increase, even though they kept hearing about, well, generic prices are going down and these other prices are getting more competitive. Why are my costs going up? And they asked the right questions at the time, which is, why does this index not reflect reality? And what they found when they started digging was literally to a point that it resulted in a massive financial settlement just to avoid an incriminating court case result.
Yeah, in today's dollars, it would be a lot bigger, I think.
It
And
would, yeah, even bigger.
it's amazing. It's a reference point for price. So similar to when I think about a benchmark, I'm like, this is something you can always look at. And then AWP has discounts off of that throughout the rest of the supply chain. But at least they have a starting point. So that's
Right. And it's the reliance on that fixed starting point that has caused this industry to basically continue or persist to rely on AWP. So
okay.
AWP, these court cases and the data analytics of multiple really, really smart people in this industry have proven time and again that AWP is not anchored to any reality. It is not a good or accurate reflection in any sense of the real world price of drugs. We all kind of universally agree that it's terrible at predicting drug price. That's the funny thing. If you look at the website for the First Data Bank is no longer publishing AWP, but the largest publisher of AWP right now, Wolters Kluwer, if you go to their website, they actually have a disclaimer on the website that, and I'm going to paraphrase here, you can go read it yourself, but it clarifies AWP is not intended to reflect real world drug prices, shouldn't be relied upon as a real benchmark of true drug pricing in the marketplace. Again, a paraphrase there, but important to realize that pretty much every one of the publishers of AWP has either been sued into not publishing it anymore or has to publicly acknowledge that it's basically a bogus index and no one really believes that it reflects drug price. So why does it persist in contracts? And the answer there is because it preserves legacy economics for the intermediaries that have relied on it for profit for so long, that changing to a more rational index, which we did, I think, at least 8 years ago at this point when we moved to NADAC, changing to a more rational index would upend the economics of these public companies to a point where it would be financially devastating to them. And so they've avoided this rational new world reality for as long as they can. They are clinging to AWP essentially for dear life. And this is why it persists in the industry.
It's fascinating because I think another little part of history, you mentioned NADAC, that became a thing in the early, it was like 2011 realm, plus or minus a year or two.
It was a product of investigations into the troubles of AWP, into how faulty AWP was as a reliable benchmark. The end result of that investigation by the government was that the government decided there is no way we can rely on AWP for important government cost centers like Medicaid, which is why now the vast majority of Medicaid plans either use NADAC or some state-level proxy for NADAC.
Got it. It's a real acronym soup here, right?
We're already in it.
Yeah.
Because folks need to understand what those are all about too, if you want to get your head around the typical PBM contract. So while AWP, I think, again, we can all agree, terrible predictor of real world drug prices.
Ain't what's paid.
Ain't what's paid, right? But in particular for generics, this is, and for certain multi-source brands. And that's because the discount off of AWP for a generic can swing anywhere from AWP minus a few percentage points to AWP minus 99.9%.
Oh, wow.
Anything in between. It can even swing north of AWP. And so because of that wild volatility of real world price compared to AWP, the PBM stepped in many years ago and said, well, hang on a sec. We can't really use AWP to negotiate with our retail pharmacies. There's no way that we could rationally price on that. So clients, trust us, let us create a new list. Let us create a list that we manage that we think more accurately reflects the real world price of generics, multi-source brands, et cetera. And thus evolved the maximum allowable cost list, which was essentially a negotiated unit price list between PBM and pharmacy chain, right? That allowed the PBM to cap the cost of these drugs so that they didn't run wildly off the rails according to these AWP prices. Now, that's actually ostensibly a pretty good idea at first, right? Because we want to tether drug prices to things that are based somewhat in reality. But what happened, as often does when we've got profit-seeking middlemen that have control over a price index or list, is that the large PBM started using the MAC list as a tool of price arbitrage, as a way to extract hidden value. Use one MAC list for reimbursement to the pharmacies, use a different MAC list for what we charge a client. Use one MAC list for this client, use a different MAC list for this other client. To a point now where we have not a PBM managing 1, 2, or 3 MAC lists, but evidence, literally court evidence that shows a single PBM might be managing literally thousands of MAC lists across their book of business. That in essence, they price arbitrage at the client, claim, and member level, which actually explains why when two people from the same PBM walk into the same pharmacy on the same day, one right behind the other in line, getting the same drug at the same quantity, let's say they're twins, that twin 1 might be charged one price and twin 2 might be charged a price that is 1.5, 2 times, 3 times that amount. And the only difference is which MAC list happened to be deployed for administration of that claim.
Okay, got it. And then you mentioned NADAC a couple times already, or NADAC if you prefer. Some people prefer NADAC, National Average Drug Acquisition Cost.
Sure.
Just tell me a little bit about that as a benchmark, and then we'll get into one or two more acronyms and we'll go on from here.
Yeah, well, Medicaid programs realized it early on. The commercial market is now largely coming around to this realization that NADAC or NADAC has advantages over old world benchmarks like AWP. First of all, survey-based. So AWP, you could argue, is a survey of one entity. It is the manufacturer. They make up the price and they can do whatever they want with it. And so it's totally arbitrary. NADAC, however, is controlled by survey data from multiple pharmacies that are reporting in to this analytic engine that intakes this data and derives a reliable real-world reflection of what transactional costs are for acquisition of those drugs to the retail pharmacy. So remember, it's an acquisition, national average drug acquisition cost. Acquisition is an important word there. It defines the average of what pharmacies acquire drugs for and put it on their shelf. And this is really great because in the future state of healthcare, I think it's pretty plain to see. You look at legislative patterns, regulatory patterns, you look at buying patterns for employers and plan sponsors. The world is moving to cost plus healthcare. That distrust of the old world model is basically saying, look, we all need to get on a cost plus platform. And NADAC conveniently provides a nationally published, reliable index for that very cost plus economic to occur within the retail setting. In a perfect world, we would have the true acquisition cost, the precise acquisition cost of every single retail pharmacy in some mega index somewhere that we could reference. And then we would tack on a fair dispensing fee for the service of the pharmacy that they deliver. But let's be honest, to track and monitor the true actual acquisition costs across 62,000 pharmacies, dozens and dozens and dozens of chains and independents, it would be operationally impossible to do. So NADAC gets us virtually all the way there with a reliable average. It's still tethered to reality, but it doesn't require the unimaginable lift that would be required for true acquisition cost adjudication.
And everybody's incentives would have to be aligned. They'd be okay with that. And then I think one other, you mentioned retail pharmacy here is important. There's another acronym that I think UNC, is that?
Yeah, UNC is the usual and customary, or what I like to call sort of the street price of the drug. Let's imagine you don't have a benefit plan that's covering you. Let's walk into a pharmacy, you need a drug. They will sell it to you at a cash price. You don't have to have benefits coverage to buy a drug, but that cash price is often higher than what the benefit plan price is. And that's because most PBMs have negotiated into their arrangement this notion that their price that they get from the pharmacy is never going to be higher or worse than the usual and customary, the street cash price for that drug that the pharmacy is charging. That has an inflationary or upward price pressure impact on UNC because no pharmacy is going to charge a really low cash price for the drug, knowing that they would then have to concede that price to every single PBM that they do business with. And so UNC, it's the cash price, but let's be honest, it tends to be pretty inflated relative to what the real world cost of drugs are.
Interesting. Okay. And then variations, I said a couple. So average acquisition cost and
Yeah.
predictive acquisition cost, anything worth mentioning there? Or are they just other variations
The deeper you get into the nerdy chasm of drug pricing acronyms, the more you realize that these are modified versions of a couple of things we've already talked about that generally have disadvantages compared to them, but no real upside or advantage.
Okay.
What we are seeing as a trend is the move away from old world benchmarks like AWP and towards benchmarks that are either NADAC or NADAC-like. We're seeing this even within the retail setting. So I want to be clear, not every pharmacy likes to contract on NADAC. Most of them actually like it because it provides more sustainable, reliable reimbursement levels that afford them a future in the ecosystem of healthcare instead of some of the volatility of MAC lists that can really turn their economics upside down. So pharmacies generally like NADAC, but certain chains now are coming up with their own version of NADAC, if you will, sort of NADAC with an asterisk next to it. Maybe they pull in some of their own internal economics, but at least it's consistent with this pattern that we are seeing more broadly, which is healthcare is moving to cost plus economics. And you're either there already, like our book of business, or the PBM is going to be dragged there kicking and screaming.
Okay. So you were talking a little bit about the regulation and the forces that are pushing us toward this cost plus world. You talked a lot about this with Lloyd at the Partner Summit. You went on a road trip around the US, and some of the states have different versions of this where they have it's a NADAC plus dispense fee or some other variations of transparency on pricing. I mean, if we go back in the last couple of years, gosh, Antonio Chacha and his team have done a ton of work on different states, Washington being one of them, and how prices compare. Mark Cuban, of course, cost plus drugs, negotiating these prices, making them publicly available, the implications of that. Trump RX most recently. CVS launched True Cost December 2023. So it's been a couple of years. What's really like the impact of this, in your opinion? Like, what does the future state look like? What's the impact on the intermediaries and the plan sponsors if we do get this shift right and we can move to a better place with more stable prices for drugs at the register?
I've been in this industry for a while, as I mentioned early. I've never seen a storm quite as perfect as this. When you think about the prevailing winds, the prevailing forces that are at play here, and I think there are, I would say, 4 of them. They all converge in a manner that thrusts this industry forward towards a very specific destination, as I was talking about, sort of this cost plus concept of the future state of pricing. The 4 forces, I'm going to walk through them, okay? I know people like lists of 3. I've heard that. I'm going to break the rule today. I'm going to break my typical rule of keep it to 3. There are 4 massive trade winds at play here. Number 1, you mentioned it, state regulation. The federal government's a little slow to move here, as they typically are, but states are the crucibles, right, of reform when it comes to focusing on problems within industries like this. And so we are seeing specific state legislation that is mandating at least NADAC-based reimbursement to pharmacies, right? They're worried about independent pharmacies in their state, et cetera. There's state regulation that is prohibiting spread price that's tied to like MAC lists and AWP and all that, those old world metrics. So state regulation, one massive force. Number 2, second massive force, retail economic breaking point. So we've got retail pharmacies now that are basically throwing up their hands saying, I cannot sustain my business anymore under the old world model. The MAC pricing, it's too volatile. I can't predict. I'm losing money on 30% of the claims that I dispense, and I'm just going to close. So to all the patients that are in my rural area or that are in my inner city neighborhood, good luck finding your next pharmacy, but it's not going to be me. And this is why we're ending up with pharmacy deserts and why we're ending up with closures, even within large chains, right? And why the pharmacy experience is starting to fail us as patients. So that's force number 2. I'm on to 3 here. Number 3 is the new emergence of cash pay offer prices for expensive products. Things like, you mentioned it, Trump RX, things like Mark Cuban cost plus drugs, things like within the world of GLP-1s, one of the fastest growing areas of cost for many clients is direct offers from Lilly, from Novo Nordisk, offering prices that are net of all these supply chain discounts, real world prices out in front that patients can now see and scrutinize. And that patients are comparing that against what they're being charged under the benefit plan and scratching their head and starting to ask, real tough questions about why this disparity exists. Here's number 4, class action lawsuits. Class action lawsuits that specifically are looking at the massive gap between AWP-based pricing for certain benefit plans and more rational pricing. Often these lawsuits will reference NADAC among other real-world drug price indices. And they're using that as the common sense benchmark against the absurdist alternative reality of AWP, right? Ain't what's paid. And so those 4 forces, you put those all into a petri dish or whatever, pick your scientific analogy. You put those all together, and what you end up with is lightning in a bottle, which is the catalyst for change here. And that's why this is suddenly such an important topic, not just for plan sponsors, but for patients, for politicians, for people in general.
Yeah, it's really cool. And it's exciting to see what will happen here because it sheds a lot of light on something that people are asking a lot of questions about. And now you can see a GLP-1 costs $149 for the first dose, right? Or you can get an MS medication for substantially cheaper than you could ever before. So it's cool. One last question for you, Josh. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us today. What's the most astonishing thing, I have to ask you, and Lloyd always gives me a hard time about asking this question, that you've seen related to this topic that you can share safely, of course. I know you've seen a lot because of all the contracts that are chasing you and your nightmares back in the day. But what can you compliantly share with us? That's a good story to send us off on drug pricing and the evolution of drug pricing and where we're going.
The most astonishing thing, Justin, is that after all of this time we just spent talking about drug prices and unit cost and how to think more rationally about the price of a drug, and that clients are really worried about that, the most astonishing thing is that that's not even the thing that's moving the needle right now on cost. That's not even the real source of potential cost savings or cost containment that clients need to consider. Because we haven't even tiptoed into the world of drug mix, the world of the 1,000 tiny decisions that the PBM makes on behalf of the plan sponsor and the patient every day that can be net additive or net subtractive to drug cost, the total tally of pharmaceutical costs in the United States. And if you think that these challenges around AWP versus NADAC versus MAC versus WAC, if you think that that has a sizable impact, and it does, then wait till you see the rest of the iceberg that's sitting underneath the water surface. And that's drug mix. That's the decisions that are being made every day around how much to dispense, which drug to dispense, and how to steer patients. And that's an even bigger topic for a whole nother episode.
Well, we'll have to link Kristen Begley and Mike Mealy's replay of the pharmacist and actuary, and I'll have to dig up some of the other drug mix related content to complement this show. Josh, thank you so much for taking the time today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Astonishing Healthcare. Head over to judy.health and visit the Insights section for show notes and other relevant content. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And definitely share the link to this show with your network. Have a great rest of your day.